thank you all for coming. Thanks to St. Francis College for sponsoring this. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm under instruction not to read much longer than about 25 minutes to half an hour. So I've just pulled out my watch and the time begins. I want to read to you from my new book, There's Something I Want You to Do. And I should probably explain something about the title, which is that when I would say about 3 years ago, I was at the Tyrone Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis and was watching a production of Hamlet, and I was struck by the fact that the premise for that play begins with a request moment from the ghost of Hamlet's father, that he wants Hamlet to avenge his death, to honor his mother, and to remember him, and to do it as expeditiously as he could. And soon after that, for reasons we don't have to go into, I happened to see a student production of King Lear, and I thought that's very interesting. This play also begins with a request moment of Lear asking his daughters to tell him how much they love him, and based on what they say, he will parcel out his estate. It's an example of pretty bad estate planning, I have to say. But I thought, there are many ways in which request moments create something associated with a social fabric, and that has to do with what we feel our sense of obligation to others may be. So I began writing this book, and there are 10 sections to it. The first 5 stories are bravery, loyalty, charity, chastity, and forbearance. And in every one of these stories, somebody turns to somebody else and says, there's something I want you to do. The second half of the book consists of, let's see if I can remember, lust, gluttony, sloth, avarice, and vanity. Same characters turn up in the second half of the book whom you see in the first. I'll read you some sections of Bravery. And Bravery has in it a character named Dr. Elijah Elliott Jones, who is going to turn up much later, many years later, in Gluttony and a couple of the other stories. When we see him in Gluttony, he's grown quite fat, and he's become a compulsive eater of snack food. This story, you'll see him as he is when he's young, and one of the things I had in mind was to try to give the arc of the early years of a marriage. And after I finished the story, what I think I saw I had been doing was to talk about, or was to dramatize what I think is the increasing fluidity of gender roles and the discomfort that some people feel with those roles. I don't mean to thematize it. I'll just read now for a while. And these are sections that I have taken out of the story. So it's called Bravery. When she was a teenager, her junior year, her favorite trick involved riding in cars with at least 2 other girls. You needed a cluster in there, and you needed to have the plainest one driving. They'd cruise University Avenue in Palo Alto until they spotted some boys together near a street corner. Boys were always ganged up at high visibility intersections, marking territory and giving off cigarette smoke and musk. At the red light, she'd roll down the window and shout, "Hey, you guys!" The boys would turn toward the car slowly, very slowly, trying for cool. Smoke emerged from their faces, from the nose or mouth. "Hey, do you think we're pretty?" she'd shout. "You think we're cute?" Except for the plain one behind the wheel, the girls she consorted with were cute. So the question wasn't really a test. The light would turn green, and they'd speed away before the boys could answer. The pleasure was in seeing them flummoxed. Usually one of the guys, probably the sweetest or the most eager one, would nod and raise his hand to wave. Susan would spy him, the sweet one, through the back window, and she'd smile so that he'd have that smile to hold onto all night. Despite what other girls said, boys were not all alike. You had to make your way through their variables blindly, guessing at hidden qualities, the ones you could live with. You had to find one whose craziness was large enough to include you. Years later in college, her roommate said to her, "You always go for the kind ones, the considerate ones, those types. I mean, where's the fun? I hate those guys. Give me a troublemaker any day." "Yeah, but a troublemaker will give you trouble," Susan said. She was painting her toenails even though the guys she dated never noticed her toenails. "Trouble comes home," she said. "It moves in. It's contagious." "I can take it. I'm an old-fashioned girl," her roommate said with her complicated irony. Susan eventually married one of the sweet ones, the kind of man who waved at you. At a San Francisco art gallery on Van Ness, gazing at a painting of a giant pointed index finger with icicles hanging from it, she had felt her concentration jarred when a guy standing next to her said, "Do you smell something?" He sniffed and glanced up at the ceiling. Metaphor? Irony? A come-on? As a pickup line, that one was new to her. In fact, she had smelled something, a rotten egg scent, so she nodded. "We should get out of here," he said, gesturing toward the door, past the table with the wine glasses and the sign-in book. "It's a gas leak." Before the explosion. "Maybe it's the paintings," she said. "The paintings? Giving off an explosive gas?" he asked. "That's an odd theory." "Could be," she said. "Maybe like a modernist assault or something?" He shrugged. "Well, it's rotten eggs or natural gas, one of the two. I don't like the odds. Let's leave." On the way out, he introduced himself as Elijah, and she laughed and spilled some white wine. She had forgotten she was holding a glass of it onto her dress just above the hemline. He handed her a monogrammed handkerchief that he had pulled out of some pocket or other, and the first letter on it was E, so he probably was an Elijah after all. A monogrammed handkerchief. How weird. Maybe he had money. "Here," he said, "go ahead, sop it up." He hadn't tried to press his advantage by touching the handkerchief against the dress. He just handed it over, and she pretended to use it to soak up the wine. With the pedestrians passing by and an overhead neon sign audibly humming, he gave off a blue-eyed air of benevolence, but he also looked on guard, hyper-vigilant, as if he were an ex-Marine. God knows where he had found the benevolence, or where any man ever found it. 20 minutes later in a coffee shop down by the Embarcadero, she learned that he was a pediatric resident with a particular interest in mitochondrial disorders. Now she understood. Out on the street, he had looked at her the way a doctor looks at a child. She herself was a psychiatric social worker with a job waiting for her at an outpatient clinic in Millbrae. She and Elijah exchanged phone numbers. That night, rattled by their encounter, she couldn't sleep. 3 days later, still rattled, she called him and proposed a date, something her mother had told her never to do with a man. They went out to dinner and a movie, and Elijah fell asleep during the previews and didn't wake up for another hour. Poor guy, he was so worn out from his work. She didn't bother to explain the plot. A villain had threatened the end of the world, the usual. Elijah was too tired to care. A few months after they were married, they took a trip to the Czech Republic. The plan was to get pregnant over there amid the European bric-a-brac. In Prague, the Soviet-era hotel where they stayed smelled of onion, chlorine, and goulash. The lobby had mirrored ceilings. Upstairs, the rooms were small and claustrophobic. The TV didn't work, and all the signs were nonsensical. Pozor, for example, which seemed to mean beware. Beware of what? The signs were garbles of consonants. Prague wasn't Kafka's birthplace for nothing. Still, Susan believed the city was the perfect place for them to conceive a child. After they had made love and dressing in street clothes, they walked down Belahorska toward the spot on the map where the Loretto Chapel, I'm cutting a lot, they plan to go to the Loretto Chapel because they hear that it is decorated with babies, where the chapel was supposed to be. In late summer morning, Susan detected traceries of autumnal chill, a specifically Czech irony in the air, with high, wispy cirrus clouds threading the sky like promissory notes. He took her hand, clasping it very hard, checking both ways as they crossed the tramway tracks, the usual pozor warnings posted on their side of the platform, telling them to exercise caution toward whatever. The number 18 tram lumbered toward them silently from a distance up the hill to the west. 15 minutes later, standing inside one of the chapels, Susan felt herself soften from all the procreative excess on display. Surrounding them on all sides, in the front, at the altar, in the back, near the choir loft, where the carved cherubs played various musical instruments, and on both walls were plump, winged infants in various postures of angelic gladness. She'd never seen so many sculpted babies in one place, cherubs not doing much of anything except engaging in a kind of abstract, giggling frolic, freed from both gravity and the earth, the great play of being inviting worship. What bliss! God was in the babies, but you had to look up or you wouldn't see them. The angelic orders were always above you. At the front, the small cross on the altar rested at eye level, apparently trivial, unimportant, outnumbered in this nursery of angels. For once, the famous agony had been trumped by babies who didn't care about the crucifixion or hadn't figured it out. They loved their children, Susan whispered to Elijah. They worshiped their infants. There, he said, pointing to a baby angel. How about that one? That one will be ours. The doctor says so. The angel he had pointed to had wings, as they all did, but this one's arms were outstretched as if in welcome, and the wings were extended as if the angel were about to take flight. After leaving the chapel, walking down a side street to the old city, they encountered a mad woman with gray snarled hair and only 2 visible teeth, who was carrying a shopping bag full of scrap cloth. She had caught up to them on the sidewalk, emerging from the alleyway, and she began speaking to them in rapid, vehement Czech, poking them both on their shoulders to make her unintelligible points. Everything about her was untranslatable, but given the way she was glaring at them, she seemed to be engaged in prophecy of some kind. And Susan intuited that the old woman was telling them both what their future lives together would be like. You will eventually go back to your bad hotel, you two, she imagined the old woman saying in Czech, and you will have your wish with that good-hearted husband of yours. You will conceive a child, your firstborn, a son, and you will realize that you're pregnant because when you fall asleep on the night of your son's conception, you will dream of a giant raspberry. How do I know this? Look at me. It's my business to know I'm out of my mind. Eli gently nudged the woman away from Susan, taking his wife's hand and crossing the street. When Susan broke free from her husband's grip and looked back, she saw the crone shouting, "You're going to be so terribly jealous of your husband because of the woman in him." The old woman screamed in Czech, or so Susan imagined, but somehow that made no sense, and she was still trying to puzzle it out when she turned around and was hit by a tram that had slowed for the Malostranski stop. The following commotion, people surrounding her, Elijah asking her nonsensical diagnostic questions, was all a bit of a blur, but only because everyone except for her husband was speaking Czech or heavily accented English, and before she knew it, she was standing up. She looked at the small crowd assembled around her, tourists and citizens, and in an effort to display good health, she saluted them. Only after she had done it, and people were staring, did she think that gestures like that might seem strange and inappropriate. "Good God," Elijah said, "why did you do that?" "I felt like it," she told him. "Are you okay? Where does it hurt?" he asked, touching her professionally. "Here? Or here?" "It doesn't hurt anywhere," she said. "I just got jostled. I lost my balance. Can't we go have lunch?" The tram driver was speaking to her in Czech, but she was ignoring him. She glanced down at her jeans. "See? I'm not even scuffed up." "You almost fell under the wheels," Elijah half groaned. "Really, Eli, really, please, I'm fine. I've never been finer. Can't we go now?" Strangers were still muttering to her, and someone was translating. When they calmed down and went back to their business after a few minutes, she felt a great sense of relief. She didn't want anybody to think of her as a victim. She was no one's and nothing's victim ever. Or maybe she was in shock. "So here we are," Eli said. "We've already been to a chapel. We've seen a baby. We talked to a crazy person. You got hit by a tram, and it's only 11. "Well, all right," she said. "Let's have coffee if we can't have lunch." He held her arm as they crossed the street and made their way to a sidewalk cafe with a green awning and a signboard that seemed to indicate that the cafe's name had something to do with the sheep. The sun was shining madly in its touristy way. Ashtrays, theirs was cracked, were placed on all the tables, and a man with a thin, wiry white beard and a beret was smoking cigarette after cigarette nearby. He gazed at Susan and Elijah with intense indifference. Susan wanted to say, "Yes, all right, we're stupid American tourists like the rest of them, but I was just hit by a tram." The waiter came out and took their order, 2 espressos. What she saw in her dream wasn't a raspberry. The crone had gotten that part wrong. What she saw was a tree, a white pine, growing in a forest alongside a river, and the tree swayed as the wind pushed at it, setting up a breathy, whistling sound. They named their son Raphael, which, like Michael, was an angel's name. Eli claimed that he had always liked being an Elijah, so they had looked up angel names and prophet names on Google and quickly discarded the ones like Zadkiel and Jeremiel that were just too strange. After they brought Raphael home from the hospital, they set up a routine so that if Eli was home and not at the hospital, he would give Raphael his evening feeding. On a Tuesday night, Susan went upstairs and found Elijah holding the bottle of breast milk in his left hand while their son lay cradled in his right arm. They had painted the room a boy's blue, and sometimes she could smell the paint. Adhesive stars were fixed to the ceiling. A small twig snapped inside her. Then another twig snapped. She felt them physically. Looking at her husband and son, she could not breathe. "You're holding him wrong," she said. I'm holding him the way I always hold him, Eli said. Raphael continued to suck milk from the bottle. It's not a big mystery, he said. I know how to hold babies. It's what I do. She heard the sound of a bicycle bell outside. The thick bass line of an overamped car radio approached them and then receded down the block. She inhaled with great effort. He's uncomfortable, she said. You can tell. Look at the way he's curled up. Actually, no, Elijah said, moving the baby to his shoulder to burp him. You can't tell. He's nursing just fine. From his sitting position, he looked up at her. Excuse me. This is my job, he said. There's something I can't stand about this, Susan told him. Give me a minute. I'm trying to figure it out. She walked into the room and leaned against the changing table. She glanced at the floor, trying to think of how to say to Eli the strange thought that had an imminent crushing weight, that she had to say aloud or she would die. I've told you you're not holding him right. And I told you that I am. Eli, she said, I don't want you feeding him. There, she had said it. I don't want you nursing him. I'm the mother here. You're not. What? You're kidding. You don't want me nursing him. Now or ever. I don't want you feeding Raphael. Period. That's ridiculous. What are you talking about? I can't stand it. I'm not sure why, she said, but I can't. Susan, listen to yourself. Listen to what you're saying. You don't get to decide something like this. We both do. I'm as much a parent here as you are. All I'm doing is holding a baby bottle with your breast milk in it while Raphael sucks on it and then, well, now, I'm holding him on my shoulder while he burps. He had a slightly clinical, almost diagnostic expression on his face, checking her out. Actually, no, I don't think you're paying attention to what I'm saying, she said. She fixed him with a sad look, even though what she felt was positive rage. Inwardly, she was resisting the impulse to snatch their baby out of his arms. With one part of her mind, she saw this impulse as an animal truth, if not actually unique to her, but with another part she thought, every mother feels this way. Every mother has felt this. It's time for me to stand up. She was not going to chalk this one up to postpartum depression or hormonal imbalances or feminine moodiness. She had come to this truth, and she would not let it go. She felt herself lifting off. She said, you can't be his mother. You can't do this. I won't let you. You're in a moment, Susan, he said. You're going to get over it. No, she said, I will not get over it. Raphael burped onto Eli. I'll never go over it, and you will not fucking tell me that I will. Please stop shouting, he said, ostentatiously calm. This is not your territory, she said. This is mine. You can't have it. Are we going to argue about metaphors? He asked, because that's the wrong metaphor. We aren't going to argue about anything, she said. Put him down. Put him into the crib. Eli stood for a few seconds, and then with painfully executed elaboration, he lowered Raphael into the crib and pulled the blue blanket that Eli's mother had made for the baby over him. He started up the music box and turned around. Both of his hands were tightened into fists. I'm going out, he said. I've got to go out right now. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, he was gone. She went downstairs and turned on the TV. On the screen, she kept the sound muted because she didn't really want to get attached to the story. A man with an eagle tattoo on his forearm aimed a gun at a distant figure of indistinct gender. The man fired, whereby the distant figure fell. The screen cut to a brightly lit room where male authority figures of some kind were jotting down notes and answering landline telephones while they sipped from cups of coffee. She felt her eyes getting heavy, and then another older woman was hit by a tram in Prague, which was how she knew she was dreaming. Sleeping, she wondered when Eli would return. She wondered for a moment where her husband had gone. When she woke up, Eli stood before her, bleeding from the side of his mouth, a bruise starting to form just under his left eye. His knuckles were caked and bloody. On his face was an expression of joyful defiance. He was blocking the TV set. It was as if he had come out of it somehow. She stood up and reached toward him. "You're bleeding," she said. He brushed her hand away. "Let me bleed." "What did you say?" "You heard me. Let me bleed." He was smilingly jubilant. The smile looked like one of the smiles on the faces of the angels in the Loretto Chapel. "What happened to you?" she asked. "You got in a fight. My God, we have to put ice on you or something." She reached for him again, and then he moved away from her. "Leave me alone." "Listen," he said, straightening up. "You want to know what happened? This is what happened. I was angry at you, and I went walking, and I ended up in Alta Plaza Park. I walked in there, where it was dark, those steep stairs on Clay Street, and this is the thing, I wanted to kill somebody. That's a kind of new emotion for me, wanting to kill somebody. I mean, I wasn't looking for somebody to kill, but that was what I was thinking. I'm just trying to be honest here. So I went up the stairs and I found myself at the top with the famous view of the city. Everybody admires the view, and I looked off in the distance and I thought I heard a scream somewhere off there in the distance, and so, I went toward the scream the way anybody would. So I made my way off into the shadows, and what I saw was this other thing. What other thing? Yeah, that's right, this other thing. This guy was beating up this woman, and so I went in. I wasn't even thinking. I went in and grabbed the guy, and I slugged him. And he punched me in the kidneys. The woman, I think she stood up. No, I know she stood up because she said something in Spanish, and she ran away. I was fighting this guy, and she took off. She didn't stay. I know she ran because when I hit the guy, I saw her running away, and I saw that she was barefoot. This was in Alta Plaza Park? Yeah. That's in Pacific Heights. They don't usually have crime over there. Well, they did tonight, he said. I was fighting with this guy, and I finally landed a good one, and I broke his jaw. I heard it break. That was when he took off. He smiled. God damn, I feel great. She lifted his hand and touched the knuckles where scabs were forming. So, you were brave. Yes, I was. You saved her. Anybody would have done it, he said. No, she said, I don't think so. She led him upstairs and sat him down on the edge of the bathtub. With a washcloth, she dabbed off the blood from his hands and face. There was something about his story that she didn't believe. And then, for a moment, she didn't believe a word of it. But she continued to wash him tenderly as if he were the hero he said he was. He groaned quietly when she touched some newly bruised part of him. He would look terrible for a while. How happy that would make him. She could easily get some steak or hamburger or whatever you were supposed to apply to black eyes to make the swelling go away, but no, he wouldn't want that. He would want his badge. They all wanted that. Should we go to bed, doctor? She asked. Yes, he said. I love you, she said. They would postpone the argument about feedings until tomorrow or next week. I love you too, he said. She took him upstairs and undressed him just as if he were a child before lowering him onto the sheets. He sighed loudly. She could hear Raphael's breaths coming from the nursery. She was about to go into her son's room to check on him and then thought better of it. Standing in the hallway, she heard a voice coming out of the air asking, "What will you do with another day?" Who had asked that? Eli was asleep. Anyway, it was a nonsensical question. The air had asked it, or she was hearing voices. She went into the bathroom to brush her teeth. She didn't quite recognize her own face in the mirror, but the reflected, swollen, tender breasts were still hers, and the smile when she thought of her husband bravely fighting someone somewhere, that was hers too. Thank you. Jason asked me about at what point the organic structure of these stories made itself apparent to me. And I have to say that it came fairly late in the game. And it came from a source that many of you in this room might recognize, which is, and I don't ordinarily like to start sentences this way, but one time in my therapist's office, my therapist asked me, when you hear your mother speaking to you, what do you hear her saying? And I said, I hear her saying, there's something I want you to do. I had, my mother was a bossy woman in the era before feminism really allowed strong women like that a place in which they could find themselves, doors that would open to the world for them. And I was very much the recipient, as the youngest child, of the sorts of obligations that she tended to put on us, my two brothers having decamped for military schools fairly early on. And I began to think that I wanted stories that made this sense of how other people can organize our lives for us if we're not vigilant, how that process can take over the way that we live not our own lives, but the lives that other people have in mind for us to live. And I thought that's a very interesting kind of situation. And it has, for me, it has a lot of dramatic power. And I think I had written this story and Bravery and Loyalty, and I was working on one called Chastity, which is about a stand-up comedian, a woman, when I thought, I'm doing similar things in all of these stories, and that's when it became apparent to me that, in some sense, I will not say, because I don't believe that I was working out my therapy in these stories, because I don't think that that's what fiction does. But I did think that something that was important to me in my understanding of who I was and how I had organized my life was going into them. Some of you may have seen the great series by Klosowski, The Decalogue. And it was a series that he made for Polish television with the virtues and the vices, sort of encoded within the stories he was telling. And I thought, that's very interesting. Nobody has written stories of that kind in this country for a long time. What if I were to write stories with a feeling for the moral life, but without any moralism? Is that possible? Can it be done both seriously and comedically? It also came almost by accident, because I had written Bravery and Loyalty, and I hadn't thought that I was going to be doing a series of these stories. But you tend, I think, when you're working on a book, to look to see where you've gone and to ask yourself, where can this go? What can I do with it? How much force does it have as a as a blueprint for what I might want to do. And then I just set about doing the rest of the stories in any way that I could find.
So one other thing I wanted to ask you about is I teach a lot, I use your essays a lot in classes, and so I have two questions about those essays. One is also about, I think, sort of process, because I guess I'm wondering if does it start with a particular work of literature? Does it start with Hamlet? And then you're wondering something about Hamlet, and then that takes you somewhere? Or do you just sort of notice that you've been making notes about similar things without really realizing it? So the same thing is sort of how conscious is it?
Yeah, I feel the way William Maxwell did when he was asked a question like this, which his answer was, nothing that I have learned about the writing of fiction has helped me at all when I've started a new book. And what I know about the making of fiction is of very little use to me when I'm working on first drafts. I have a shovel, I'm digging a ditch, I don't know where it's going, I don't know where it's going to end up. I have some idea of where I may want it to arrive, but all of these elements that I have taught my students down through the years, whether it's the request moment or one-way gates, or I have this thing about Captain Happen, the figure who makes things happen. None of this is any use until I get to the revision process. In the first draft, all I'm trying to do is tell the truth and to try to create something beautiful and to get the characters down any way I can and to have them do something that seems meaningful and right to me, which I recognize either from my own life or from somebody else's. I try not to lie. I try not to lie to make the story better.
So if it's no use, is it a hindrance? That sort of consciousness about, like, you're the guy who had, you know something about Epiphanies, and is that sort of, can you get that out of your head while you're writing those first drafts?
Yes, I can. If I need to write an epiphany, I will. I've written an essay against epiphanies, but if I need to have an epiphany in my story, that's the end of the rule. The stories get themselves written any way they can, and it's only, as I say, in the revision process that I start to think, maybe this scene needs another character, maybe I need to pay more attention to the sentences, this section bores me, if it bores me, it's going to bore everybody else. What do I do to it? Do I cut it? Do I add something? Maybe I need a sounding board character here. That's when whatever I know about the making of fiction may come in. I never did. Thank you for asking. I would like to, but I feel I don't know enough about stagecraft to make a play work. I can get people talking, but that's not the same thing as writing a good play. And I do spend a lot of time trying to hear what the characters are saying. And like many of the writers in this room, I'm being very presumptuous here, but like many of the writers in this room, as I'm writing dialogue, I speak it aloud to myself. Apparently Dickens stood in front of mirrors, acting out his characters. I don't do that. But I do say aloud what they're saying so that it sounds right to me. And the other thing that I've been doing lately in the dialogue that I've been writing has been to make sure that the characters are not always listening to each other. Because I feel that more for a younger generation of writers than mine, the problem, one of the significant problems of our time has to do with attention and the way attention is getting scattered. and the way that good dialogue from younger writers now often reflects the way that people do not listen to each other, or listen very selectively, and reply to things that haven't actually been said. I don't do so much of that, but in writers whose work I admire, the younger generation, they are paying attention to that.
This is another therapy question.
It's another therapy question. I don't know if those of you in the back heard the question. It had to do with the way in which I have, or anybody starts to revise the story of his or her life. And I had once said that during the time when I was a child, I thought I was having a happy childhood. I was actually having the only childhood I ever had. And when you're having the only childhood you ever have, if you're inclined to think the best of most situations, you'll think, this is a wonderful childhood. How could it be any better? Until I saw the way other people were living, and I thought, oh, it's not so good what's happening to me. I don't feel that it's exactly right of art, literary art or any other kind, to just darken matters so that we all feel terrible at the end of the play or the movie or of the story. And I have tried to the best of my ability to make things balance out as well as I can. I do tend to feel that although some of my fiction is dark, it's not as dark as life actually can get. That if you wrote a story that reflected how bad things can actually be in the world, in certain places on the planet, it would be unreadable. So I try to balance it out. And you know, every writer's book is a vision of how things are. And when one of my books, The Feast of Love, came out, there were some reviewers who said, oh, this is just frivolous, you know, this is just a comedy. So
in the drafting process, does it get darker or lighter?
The drafting process?
Like you know, you write a first draft. Are your first drafts horrifyingly dark, or the opposite?
I just try. I don't even think of that. I just think, are these characters acting in a way that I think is interesting? Are they getting themselves into interesting trouble? Does this tell us something about the way people seem to live? And is it telling? And is it dark? Is it light? That's for somebody else to decide. I'm just writing these stories the only way I know how. I think the question of influence is a terribly difficult one, partly because I think life influences us as much or more than the books we've read or the movies we've seen or the music that we've listened to. And in my own case, I wasn't always aware of what kinds of influences I was laboring under, even during the time when I was writing. Other people would look at something I had written and would say, oh, that looks like Hemingway, or some such thing. I think Stu Dieback once said that. In fact, I know he said it. I heard him say it, that writers of my generation were all affected in one way or another by Hemingway. When I started to be conscious of other writers and what I could learn from them and what I could steal from them, metaphorically, I never actually stole, I don't think. I found myself going back to the Russians, Chekhov in particular, but Tolstoy also, and among American writers, Catherine Ann Porter. I learned so much from her work that I should pay her part of my royalties, I think. Maxwell came into my life relatively late. I was working on a book called Believers, and I had some mutual friends of the Maxwells and of mine introduced me to him and to Emmy, and I had known his stories pretty well, and I had read, without really paying attention to it, his great book, So Long, See You Tomorrow. But it wasn't until I met him and I found that we had a kind of shared, I don't want to seem presumptuous, but it was a kind of shared sensibility in some respects, that I found that I still, in the middle of my life, I still had a lot to learn, and I could learn it from him, particularly a sort of generosity toward characters, that everybody, no matter how well or how badly they act, everybody has his or her own reasons, and every character needs to be treated with a certain amount of generosity. And that's true in So Long, See You Tomorrow. It's true in Time Will Darken It. It's true They Came Like Swallows and the short stories. I just came to love that work, and I go back to it constantly now. It's a great resource for me. Willie Maxwell for many years was the fiction editor at the New Yorker. Thank you, Martha, for reminding me of this. He was the fiction editor at the New Yorker. He was from Lincoln, Illinois, which was also the hometown of Langston Hughes for a while. They didn't know each other, though they were in school at the same time. His mother died in the 1919 Spanish flu epidemic, and it was the central event of his life. He was, I think, 10 years old when this happened. And it marked him. He's one of the great writers of loss and the way in which we organize, devise our lives to compensate for losses that we have taken early on. Among his novels, the one that I always recommend to people if they've never read anything of his is So Long, See You Tomorrow. And then They Came Like Swallows, Time Will Darken It, Over by the River. He was also a wonderful essayist. He edited J.D. Salinger, he edited Updike, he edited Nabokov, and you would ask him, what was it like editing these people? And he didn't like to talk about his life. He was one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever known. You'd try to get him to talk about himself, and instead he would turn it back on you. He was always more interested in you than, well, he tried to draw people out so that they wouldn't draw him out. The question was how much of my work is from real life and how much is from my imagination. In the parts of the story that I just read to you, there is one thing that I remembered, which was that one time when my son was very small, my wife and I argued about who was going to hold him and feed him. That's the only thing in the story that's from real life. And I just held on to it. I thought, that's a very strange thing to argue about. I mean, there must be better things to argue about than who's going to have the bottle and feed the baby. But, you know, when you're looking around for stories, you have to pay attention to the ones that you don't forget. Things that lodge in your memory, the sort of involuntary memories that come back to you. And you don't, there's something about them that seems odd. Gerard Manley Hopkins talked about widowed images, the kind of obsessive images that stick in your mind because you don't know what they mean. and they come back to you unbidden when you're doing the dishes or you're driving the car. And you think, that's very odd. Why am I thinking of that again? And these images have some sort of power over you. And if they have power over you, that power may transfer itself to a reader. I don't know why it was that particular evening that my wife didn't want me to bottle feed the baby. I don't know why she did. She just didn't. But it stuck in my memory, and I kind of built the story around it. The other thing actually in that story that I remembered that is from real life was that I had taken a trip to Prague. I had gone to the Loretto Chapel, and and the chapel is more or less as I described it. If you've been to churches in Mexico, one of the things that you notice is that the fixation is really on the mortification of the body of the crucified Jesus. That there's a kind of insistence on physical suffering in that culture. When you're in Prague, there's an insistence on this kind of procreative ecstasy that's presented by the imagery of these babies, these cherubim. And I thought that's very interesting. That's very interesting. So I put, and I just built the story around the thing. Sorry, I keep thinking of something else. That the opening scene of the girls in the car taunting the boys standing at the street corner, I saw that. I was at I was at a Starbucks and in Palo Alto, and this car full of these beautiful young women went by, and there were some guys at the corner, and one of the girls rolled down the window and said, "Hey, you guys, do you think we're cute? Do you think we're pretty?" And then they zoomed off. I mean, you don't throw that away. You see
So
that. You put it into something.
I think if you keep going, it'll turn out that everything you've ever written is autobiography. Anyway.
Could be. One line that somebody says to you, and that stays in your head, and there's something wonderfully strange or funny or unusual about it, and you think, I can build an entire story around this line. And I've done it too, but there has to be something about it that nags at you. Somehow its power has to be unpacked by the story that gets constructed around it. The line itself may be almost meaningless, but it's almost better if it is, because you can supply the meaning for it.
Yeah, well, thanks. This was great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all for coming.